Um, okay, I'm Andy Miller. I am a professor in the department and I organize our seminar series. So I want to welcome everybody who's here either in person or online. Our next seminar will be in 2 weeks with Dr. Alicia Chen from USGS, who's going to be talking about vulnerable communities and the response to drought. I don't have the full title in front of me because I don't have it on the screen here. And I've asked Ali Korduff, one of our graduate students, to introduce our speaker today. So Ali, take it away. Just don't trip over the board there.
Hi, I'm Ali Korduff. I'm a GES grad student. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Karin Burghardt as an assistant professor in the entomology department at the University of Maryland College Park and a research associate at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. Trained as a community ecologist, she specializes in understanding plant-insect interactions in human-modified landscapes, ranging from suburban yards to abandoned agricultural fields to managed forests. By examining how human management practices alter the support of biodiversity in these spaces, the lab research program helps determine best practices for how humans can share space with a variety of flora and fauna. Karin received her MS and PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology from Yale University, working with Oswald Smits on herbivore-induced defenses in goldenrod plants. Prior to that, she received a BS in the University of Delaware in 2007, working with Douglas Tallamy on the role of native plants in ecosystems. And you can find more information about the lab's work on the website, which is listed up here in the corner, burghardtlab.org.
Great, thank you. Yeah, thanks for that introduction and the opportunity to speak with your program today. I do study a lot of insects. I'm in the Department of Entomology, but the scope of the lab is fairly broad, and I'm really interested in how the spatial structure of resources for insects modifies those interactions. And so I have tried to make this talk a little bit more of broad interest to more of a geography department, but I'm going to go ahead and tell you there are going to be a lot of pictures of caterpillars and insects. That's just what you're going to get. So what I'm hoping to focus on today is thinking about how human-made landscapes alter the organization of ecological diversity in these landscapes. And I'm going to do that through a variety of ways. All right, this was working before.
Oh, there's something go wrong. There you go.
Yeah, okay, now it's working. Sometimes you just have to hit the button again after. Okay, so kind of coming to this idea of understanding how human-made landscapes are affecting interactions, I come to it from the perspective of plant-insect interactions in particular. So these are all the different ways that different insects that live in this area around us interact with our host plants. So specifically, this interaction, plant-insect interaction, would be one of herbivory. And it's really fascinating how all of these different individual organisms have figured out ways to exploit the same resource of a plant. They've figured out how to externally chew the leaves, convert that energy from the sun into their bodies, but they've also figured out how to pierce their mouth parts into plants to suck out sugars and use that to make their bread and butter. There are also insects that will inject hormones into plants to induce them to make structures that then will provide places for their larvae to feed. So these would be gall makers, like these synipid wasps, which you probably see on oak trees around campus in the fall. Or maybe you don't know you're looking at an insect, but next year, if you see things, strange structures on the leaves of oaks, almost all of these are wasps that have tricked the plants into creating nice tissue for their larvae to eat inside these gall tissues. And then there are also creatures that have figured out how to live inside the leaves of plants. So you can have insects that mine inside the leaf tissue of plants. And all of these interactions require insects to find their host plants on the landscape. This is the challenge for insects in general. And so the spatial arrangement of host plants matters for insect herbivores. And this is going to be a point that I'm going to come back to once I start talking about the different types of ways that humans modify landscapes. So I've been looking at this, or I've been living primarily in the Eastern United States for my entire life, and most of my career has been kind of along the Route 1 corridor. I don't think I've managed to move more than 2 miles from 95 since I was in high school. Whether this is a good or a bad thing, you can argue. But what it means is that almost everywhere I've worked is an extremely rapidly developing matrix of urban and suburban land use types for the most part. The 95 corridor is not what we would call a low density area of the US. So as a result, I really like thinking about local ecosystems and how these organisms are working and living in the places that I live as well. And so as a result, I have to think about humans. We construct a lot of the landscapes around us. So this has kind of led my research program to really think about how our human management decisions, how the spatial arrangements of plants that we create on the landscape, how this really drives plant-insect interactions. And the goal of this is to both provide information to inform best practices, but it's also to figure out whether some of our ecological theory can help us provide these recommendations and determine whether these landscapes operate the same as many of the other ecosystems that we've looked at these questions in the past. So what I'm going to be talking about today are two areas of my research. The first is a vignette about redlining in street tree communities. And this is work that I completed with also with Chris Swan as a collaborator, and this was the project I was asked to come and speak about. So I'm going to definitely cover that. And then I'm also going to talk a little bit more broadly about how spatial arrangement of trees, what we can learn about how the spatial arrangement of trees informs food web dynamics by using a large-scale tree diversity experiment that's over at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center south of Annapolis. So this first piece is going to be about policy and how policy might shape the communities of organisms that insects interact with, or other animals and humans as animals interact with. So the policy piece that we were interested in looking at was a policy that was implemented in the late in the 1930s and 40s, so quite a while ago. Is everybody familiar with redlining in this room? Okay, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but this is about an 80-year-old policy at this point that was implemented with a laudable goal of assisting struggling Americans at the risk of foreclosure. It turns out that, like many of our policy decisions, there were perverse outcomes associated with this, because when this policy was implemented and this Homeowners Loan Corporation was created by the federal government, they worked with local bankers and real estate agents to determine maps and appraise neighborhoods for the perceived safety of investment. And because we're humans, all of the biases that were present in those local real estate agents and bankers and all the biases that were present in society went into these maps. So neighborhoods were ultimately assigned an A to D grade, with A as green, the safest neighborhoods to back a mortgage, and D, which were risky neighborhoods to back a mortgage. And so these maps were drawn all over the country. 239 municipalities had these maps drawn. So this is a very widespread policy. This is the map that was drawn at Baltimore, and this is where our project is centered. And so you can see that a large portion of real estate in Baltimore was determined to be hazardous from the perspective of mortgages. And you can go and find all of these maps on University of Richmond's site, which is called Mapping Inequality. And you can read all of the descriptions that were written by these real estate brokers and bankers about why they made their decisions. And when you go and read those, they are often they're often based on the number of racial minorities living in an area. Depending on the city, they might be based on how many immigrants. So immigrants were also viewed as a hazard. Other ethnic and religious minorities were also targeted, depending on the city. So from a policy perspective, redlining was very widespread. And this also makes it interesting from an ecological perspective, because in 239 cities across the country, and around the same time period, the same types of policies were going into place. So we can kind of think about this as a replicated policy pressure on cities across the country. So this policy was often racial, ethnic, or religion-based. It is spatial, applied at around the same time. And what lots of research that had been done before we did this work has shown is that this policy led to generations of wealth loss for minority groups in the US. And this is because if you owned property in one of these neighborhoods that was deemed to be hazardous, then overnight your property value would decrease because you could no longer sell that property to a person who could then get a mortgage. And then underinvestment happened, and so you had these cycles of lost wealth and underinvestment. From an ecological perspective, what this is it represents a resource distribution in some sense. Where there were higher property values, you get more resource investment. And we know that plant communities, other types of ecological communities respond to resources. So what prompted us to start looking at this was a paper that came out in 2021, headed up by Christopher Schell. And in this paper, the authors pointed out that you basically could imagine that if you have a policy that is imposed on two different cities that imposes two different resource distributions over time, you might expect for those policies to filter through to affect plant and animal communities that are living in cities. So you might end up with a different distribution of green spaces depending on redlining that then filters through to affect the traits of the organisms that are living in that space, and also their species richness, and maybe even food webs over time. So what we really wanted to do was look at this species richness piece that they were focused on, but do it for street tree communities in Baltimore, and try to figure out how this policy was affecting the construction of street tree communities. This paper came out a couple years ago. Chris Swell was a major force within it. I recommend that you check it out if you're more interested after hearing this talk. So why were we interested in street tree communities? Well, for one thing, we know that redlining matters a lot for the tree cover in cities. This is a paper that Dexter Locke headed up that looked at tree cover across 60-something cities in the US and documented that there was often lower tree cover in previously redlined neighborhoods. And what we didn't know at this point in time was what this meant for the numbers of different species of trees that were living in these neighborhoods. Nobody had really gone in and started looking at species composition patterns. And we know that this matters, or we think that it will matter for these communities and cities, because the species composition and diversity of the communities that live in a place have important implications for cultural and biological control for integrated pest management. The diversity of those organisms helps to stabilize survival of your trees over time, and it also helps determine whether you are resistant or resilient to pest outbreaks, for example. So if we think about Dutch elm disease, if you have all the same species like elms in cities, you can have mass mortality events. And so the composition really matters from a long-term health perspective of your urban forest. This is just a figure from the diversity experiment I'm going to talk about in a minute, demonstrating that when you have monocultures of species, you have much higher variability in survival of those species over time. So this is the coefficient of variation. And so when you have diverse plots, you just have a much more stable survival over time. So we thought this might matter. And street trees are a unique place to look at this because all street trees are kind of a miracle in my mind. When I see one that's very happy and healthy and doing well, I'm very impressed because it takes a lot of effort to make that happen. Street tree locations are fairly stressful environments, and they often involve resources and time to make sure that that tree is going to become large and healthy. And so what we were predicting is that we would find potentially lower diversity of species growing in previously redlined neighborhoods, and that we might see that young and old trees would show different patterns because this policy was implemented 80 years ago, but it actually was outlawed and deemed to be discriminatory about 20 or so years later, 20, 30 years later. And so the policy ended, but the feedback loops that came from that potentially continued onward. And we were interested in parsing that out by looking at young and old trees. We also thought that maybe we'd get more similar communities of trees across previously redlined neighborhoods, and I'll get more into that in a second. So to get at this, we joined two data sets. Dexter Locke was really heavily involved in doing this part of the work. The two data sets were a 2018 tree survey of all of the street trees in Baltimore that was conducted by, I think, Davy Tree Company, and was given to us by the Baltimore City Urban Forestry team. And so we had information on 163,000 trees. We knew their DBH, we knew their species. We knew whether they were a living tree versus a stump versus a vacant spot. And that's actually really important because in a lot of our street tree inventories, we don't know if there's a spot a tree could go, yet there is not currently one. And that's going to become important in a second. And this is publicly accessible data. So if anybody else wants to look at any of this, you can download, look at all the trees in your neighborhood. And we linked this up with one of these, with the polygons from the Hulk map of Baltimore available through this Richmond site that I mentioned. And these maps are available for most of the US. So if you have a city you're interested in looking at, you can go and download it. So when we do this, when we join these data sets, we end up with about 90,000 street tree locations, because these could be a place a tree is or isn't at the moment. And about 50,000 of them contain living trees in these neighborhood grades. So we started looking at who was living there and what the density of size classes were. So this is a density kernel of the different classes of trees. And so what you can see, and this is the trees getting bigger. So basically over here we have our small trees, and over here we have our large trees. And what quickly jumps out is that in the previously redlined neighborhoods, we have a much larger proportion of small trees than we do these larger trees. And this pattern flip-flops for the large trees. The blue and green neighborhoods, which were the ones that were deemed to be the least risky for mortgages, they have the largest proportion of these larger trees. So there's something happening here with these size class distributions across neighborhoods. And so what we really wanted to do was kind of track the small trees and large trees separately. We were thinking about the large trees as really representing the legacy of investments in these areas, because these large trees take so many years to grow. And the small trees that were have a DBH of less than 5 inches or so, those we were seeing as representing maybe new investment or current investment that the city is undergoing to increase street trees in the city. So what we wanted to ask first is, okay, for each of these spots that a tree could go in the city, do we have a big or a small tree there? You're going to get a little bit, you've got a little bit of an instinct for this from this previous figure, but basically big trees are 9 times less likely to be found in a potential location in previously redlined neighborhoods. You can see basically the large trees are in these green line neighborhoods. So I think that's pretty good evidence that we can see this legacy of redlining on at least the demographics of trees across the city. Now, interestingly, when we look at small trees, the pattern flips. So for small trees, we are actually getting the largest kind of occupancy of about 20% or so of spots of small trees in these redline neighborhoods. So we're getting a lot of increased planting happening in some of these neighborhoods. So we got really curious about what was happening with these small trees because this shows that there's a lot of current investment going on. There's a lot of planting activity going on in the city, and this could be tied to the Baltimore Sustainability Plan, which is really trying to increase canopy cover across Baltimore City itself. And so what I'm going to talk about for the rest of this is kind of the community of trees that we're finding in these of small trees that we're finding in Baltimore, but I'm happy to talk about the bigger trees as well at the end. So Baltimore's planting all these trees, it's great, but why doesn't this solve all of the problem? And the reason it doesn't is because once we dove in and started looking at the diversity and composition of the species that are being found in these different neighborhoods types, we found pretty striking differences across the neighborhoods. So these are species accumulation curves that are individual based. So along the x-axis, we have the number of trees that are in the community, and then the y-axis is tree species diversity. So as we add trees to our sample, as we move from tree to tree within the redline neighborhoods, for example, how many additional new species are we finding? And on the left, you can see this is richness, this is Q. And you can see that we overall are ending up with fewer species that are being found in redline neighborhoods, even when we kind of control for the number of small trees. Because remember, we don't have that many small trees in our green, in our A ranked neighborhoods. They are mostly big. So the interesting piece to me, though, is that this pattern gets stronger as we move toward dimensions of diversity that also take into account relative abundance. So richness, which is the number of species, is just kind of one way of thinking about a community. But if we take into account relative abundance, which Shannon's index does, or Simpson's, then we actually see these differences accentuate. And we get even fewer species, less diversity and more differentiation and diversity across the neighborhoods. And so let me show you what I think is happening. So basically, we're getting lower diversity in these neighborhoods. So we can dive into this a little bit more deeply by doing some community analysis, community composition analysis. So this is an NMDS plot. This is non-metric multidimensional scaling. It's a way of trying to collapse all the variation in the species communities onto the fewest axes possible. And basically how you interpret this is if you have dots that are close to one another, each dot is a neighborhood. If you have dots that are close to one another, then those neighborhoods have a street tree community that is similar to one another. So this yellow community, this yellow neighborhood has a street tree community that shares species with this other yellow neighborhood most closely. And so when we look at the spread of these dots, what we find is that for a lot of these neighborhoods, we're getting a lot of variation in the species we're finding across the neighborhoods for green and blue and even yellow. But these red neighborhoods are really close, those dots are really close together, which means that we're getting the same species in each of those neighborhoods as the next one has. And we can look at this in a slightly different way by calculating these metrics like species reordering and turnover. And so species reordering, what we find is that we are getting a lower species reordering, lower species turnover in these neighborhoods. So you're just having the same species over and over again. we represent this with actual real species, it becomes clear what's happening. So in our A neighborhoods, we have, this is a rank abundance curve. So this is the rank of the species. And on the y-axis is the number of trees we have. And if your line is flat, you have a very even community of species. Everybody's in about the same abundance. And that's really what we see in A neighborhoods. We have a lot of species, and they're all at relatively low numbers of species that are getting planted. However, when we look at our D neighborhood communities, what we see is that it's really uneven. And so this means that only a few species are dominating that community. And what you can see is specifically Acer rubrum is getting planted at very high numbers in these neighborhoods. And that's what's driving these species community composition curves to be very similar to one another. So Acer rubrum, I've circled here, it's present in all of these communities. It's one of the, I think it's the top species in almost all of them. But the relative abundance of it is much, much higher in previously redlined neighborhoods. So that's really driving this, I think. So we're getting this lower reordering and turnover in new plantings, and that's really what seems to be driving these community differences. So what I'm going to suggest, and why I think we should think about this when we're doing tree planting efforts, is that the consequences of having lower diversity in some of these neighborhoods could result in lower long-term survival. So as I mentioned, pest species can potentially take advantage of monocultures. Ash has recently come through, caused a huge economic burden on a lot of cities where they're having to do removals. And Acer rubrum in particular has a species that likes to eat it, Asian longhorn beetle. It eats a lot of species, but Acer rubrum is one that it prefers. And it has been found multiple places in the US. There are outbreaks currently in Long Island and South Carolina. We've contained them thus far, but they could easily come to Baltimore. And so in general, I think what we're finding here is we can see these signatures of past policy on current street tree communities. And we see that Baltimore and other communities are trying to reinvest and mitigate some of that inequality. But I think as we're doing that, it's important to check in and look at what the effects of those efforts are and try to potentially create more diverse communities, or think about investing more resources in maintenance and rehabilitation in some of these D neighborhoods in order to increase survival and increase the number of species that we can use in these areas. And the reason this matters is I think that ecological feedbacks happen just like policy feedbacks do. And I'm going to demonstrate that in just one second. So I want to emphasize that it's not actually like Baltimore is deciding to plant all these trees, right? A tree planting ecosystem has many different actors. There's many folks who are making decisions about which trees to plant and where. There's community groups involved. This is kind of a bottom-up system in Baltimore relative to other municipality areas like New York City, for example. And so we don't really know what is driving this pattern of dominance of single species. It could be planting. It could also be differential survival. It could be a number of different processes. And so that same outcome of differential impacts and the same pattern that we're witnessing could happen just because we are starting with different vacancy rates across these neighborhoods. So I'm just going to demonstrate one way this could happen that actually doesn't have anything to do with municipalities choosing to plant different species. So let's say we have two different neighborhoods that start with an equal richness of species. So they've each got 10 species, but they have different vacancy rates. So let's say the folks come in, they use the same planting palette, they plant 5 species in equal proportions across these neighborhoods. So now we've got a nice healthy forest. We've got lots of species that are planting, but we do actually now have a different relative abundance of certain species. So now we have more of this species in neighborhood 2. And let's say our beetle comes and likes species A, and so we lose all those species. We're going to have differential mortality, not because the city decided to plant different numbers of species, but just because they're trying to make up for higher vacancy rates across the city. Okay, so this is, whoa, I don't.
I jumped out of full screen mode. For some reason.
Yeah. Think we're good now?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is kind of where we are with this project. What we're hoping to do is, and we have funding to do, is go back this summer with a little seed money to follow up and find a number of these small trees and figure out what has happened to them over the last 5 years or so since the survey happened, to try to kind of figure out what those processes actually are, if it's survival, if it's planting, that sort of thing. And I think ultimately it is important to kind of understand what the whole food web dynamics are at play in this system. We really focused on species richness here, but I think that understanding how this is going to affect insects and birds and all of the other elements of the city that rely on these street trees is another path to follow. So in general, what we find in a lot of cities across the US is that we have urban canopy planting campaigns with the goal of increasing this canopy cover. But as we're doing these processes, it's important to remember that cities aren't kind of these blank slates. Instead, you're starting with a palette of a lot of previous policy that can create differential outcomes even with kind of the same input. Okay. So what I want to talk about next is tree diversity in food webs. So kind of thinking about what is the impact of diversity for food webs. Any initial questions about the first redlining piece?
I do have one from online.
Sure.
Matt Fagan, whose internet is not working very well, so he asked me to read it for him. So he said, really interesting talk. He has a question on the Baltimore street tree conclusions. Is it that the abundance of small trees reflects higher recent investment in Group D areas? Or does higher abundance of small trees there reflect more available places to plant because there's fewer extant large tree canopies coupled with higher turnover?
Yeah, probably both. There are just like a sheer abundance. Like we look at the number of vacant spots, it's much higher in those redline neighborhoods. Although they're filling in, actually, I would say that proportionally, if I'm remembering correctly, some of the C neighborhoods actually now have the most vacant or the highest proportion of vacant spots because they've done a lot of recent planting in some of the D neighborhoods, and some of the C neighborhoods are a little further west and east, and those have not gotten as many planting efforts. So it seems like a spot to improve. Cool. So people can think. You're welcome to ask more questions for the end.
There's one other question, but I'm going to let you keep going. Let Chris go.
Do you think that they're planting based on these grades, or do you think that they're just planting based on dates?
Well, so there's some correlation happening here with current tree canopy, as was mentioned. So in a lot of these neighborhoods have very low tree cover, right, in some of these D neighborhoods. And those are really stressful, harsh places for some of these trees. So I think that there is some bias toward trying to plant, like, what is our hardiest species? Let's put this in this location. This is just from talking to some of the planting organizations. I don't know that people are really thinking. A lot of it is about what trees are available. You can go down a rabbit hole with like the tree supply chain and all of this in Baltimore. But my instinct is that it's a combination of harsher environments, so people limit their palette a little bit, and then maybe also some of the trees are just dying before they're even censused. And so that's one of the goals for this summer is we're trying to look at a range of 36 different species that are across the different neighborhoods to see if there's differential survival. And maybe we can make some recommendations about some tree species that have been overlooked, but could actually be doing well in some of these harsher environments.
Okay.
There you go.
So have you looked at native versus non-native distribution of survival rates? You know, Mesa River runs maybe, but have you looked at some of the other?
Yeah, I know some other folks have looked at that. Honestly, the non-native composition part of these communities is fairly low percentage-wise. So Megan Avolio has done some of this work. When we did, it wasn't a focus of this, but I want to say the proportions were a little higher. So if you go back, I can go back and look at and show you the relative abundances. Like maybe the second, third, and fourth most abundant species in the D neighborhoods are non-native, and they are less likely to be that in the A neighborhoods. So I think there's a difference. We haven't really explicitly quantified it. But I think some of that goes back to those are perceived of as hardier often than non-natives. It turns out many of them are perhaps not as hardy as we thought initially. Crepe myrtle bark scale is going to be a problem. Very soon, I suspect. So, okay, so I will jump into this, and then if you have other questions, just let me know. All right, so this is kind of getting at the question of, okay, why do we care about tree diversity from food web perspectives? And most often we are planting trees in monocultures, particularly in plantations. They cover 7% of the world's forest area are tree plantations at this point in time. But we also do a lot of tree planting that is for restoration or riparian buffers or in urban areas. And there's a lot of municipalities and states and countries that are doing this for cooling, for stormwater, for carbon storage, all kinds of reasons people are planting trees. In Maryland, we had this 5 million tree planting initiative, which was passed by the legislature in 2021. And there are trees going in all over the place right now. I'm sure you all are aware of this. So the question of this project is really, does it matter how we plant these forests? How we plant species if we're going to build a riparian buffer or if we're going to do a restoration planting? And I think about this from the perspective of the critters that use these areas, right? So I'm thinking about, okay, how is a butterfly or a moth that is flying through a forest going to perceive the species and respond to that and potentially be supported by these tree species plantings? So we've been looking at this in the context of a large-scale tree diversity experiment. This was planted at CERC in 2013, and it was planted on previous agricultural fields. This is actually part of the watershed that I think Patuxent and CERC researchers published for the first time on the importance of vegetation in riparian buffers for water quality. So it is a fairly important area for that. And basically what they did is they planted a forest on these previous agricultural land to see what this is going to do to water quality. John Parker has led this up. He is the PI on the project. Susan Cook-Patton is now at the Nature Conservancy, but she also was a postdoc in the lab and helped come up with the project. And then we've had lots of folks who've been working on this over the years. I want to highlight Kelsey McGurran, who's lab manager in my lab, and she's been doing a lot of the caterpillar work that I'm going to be showing you today. So this experiment consists of 18,000 trees. They're all native from that perspective. And they are planted at 1, 4, and 12 species diversity levels. They also are split equally amongst ecto and arbuscular mycorrhizal species. And so what I joined this project in 2016 as a postdoc, and I really was interested in, okay, how does the neighborhood around a tree change which insects are going to use this tree? So I'm interested in looking at herbivore abundance and diversity, both on individual trees and then kind of thinking about the whole experiment as a community. I like caterpillars, so we're going to talk about caterpillars. But caterpillars are really important. They feed on leaves primarily. I count sawflies in amongst the caterpillars, which are a group of wasps that feed on leaves as larvae, in addition to moths and butterflies, Lepidoptera. They feed a huge proportion of our terrestrial food webs through their bodies. And so in the experiment, what I've been doing is going out and sampling caterpillars on the same cohort of 540 trees since 2016. So I found trees, 6 trees in each of the plots, and then matched it with a 4-species polyculture and a 12-species polyculture in the same spatial arrangement. And then we have 2 replicates of each species throughout the experiment. So this ends up being 30 kind of spatial blocks that we're doing this comparison on in 540 trees. And we do visual sampling to standardize for time. So we go up to a tree, we basically sample foliage, we standardize across the number of people, we keep them the same. I'm happy to talk more about that. But basically what we've been able to capture over all this time is a lot of caterpillars are using these trees. So about 4,500 caterpillars we've found so far. This is through 2022. Our data from last summer we don't have yet. And it covers 194 species. So this is a pretty diverse community of organisms that are using these trees. So what are we finding? And what did I expect? Okay, when I started as a postdoc, this is what I said was going to happen. So I said that, okay, in the monocultures, we have a greater concentration of the same trees. And so you're going to get, over time, a higher abundance of different individuals using those trees because there's a greater resource for them to colonize, easier for them to find that source, and maybe we might get more specialists in those plots. And then for the polyculture trees, now remember, this is not for the whole plot. This is just for a single tree. So we're only measuring it like one tree, but who's around it changes. And so what I predicted for the diverse plots is, okay, maybe we'll get fewer caterpillars, but we'll get more generalists, and maybe they'll be more diverse. Pretty kind of typical predictions. Well, here's what I'm finding. So this is 5 years of doing this. And on the x-axis, we have the diversity around that tree. And then this is the average caterpillar abundance. And what you can see is consistently on a single tree, we get more caterpillars when they're surrounded by a diverse number of different tree species. And I got this data for the first like 2 years, and I was like, this has to be wrong. Like, I can't explain this exactly. And then in 2019, we sampled a little less because we were doing parasitoids, so the results were a little inconclusive. And then we went back after I got my faculty position and sampled again, and the results are very robust. So I'm now convinced that this is the true pattern that is happening in here, and that a single tree supports more caterpillars in a diverse environment. I'm currently have a draft of this to submit, and I would love feedback on different ideas about how this could be happening because I get some pushback from reviewers. What I did not find was this resource concentration, greater abundance. That was a terrible postdoc idea. So why am I finding this? Well, maybe differences in species density are helping drive this over time. Maybe there's some kind of difference in detection or acceptance rate of hosts. I'm tossing around the idea of maybe we have greater host-associated differentiation in the polyculture plot. So maybe you can support a greater abundance of species, even if it is a generalist species. So a few ideas, I would love to talk about them. Now, in terms of richness, my ideas do appear to be supported in general, especially during the first part of the experiment. So this is the caterpillar richness, and we basically are seeing greater richness with higher diversity. And the interesting part of an experiment like this is we can watch the plots be colonized over time and see what these different richness measurements are. And so like with the largest species, we really see just that these larger species are hosting a much more diverse community of caterpillars when they're growing in mixed plots versus diverse plots. Mixed plots versus one. So what does this mean for the networks? So not just if you go to an individual tree, but kind of the community of caterpillars that are using these plants. And to do this, we're looking at network interaction diagrams. So we can build these networks of interactions where we have the plants on the bottom and we have the species of caterpillars on the top. And basically when bars connect them, that means there's a feeding relationship happening between those two species. And so we can do that for our monocultures, we can do this for our polycultures, and then we can kind of compare them and see whether the different networks are similar across these different communities. And here we have about 411 documented feeding interactions. So these are pretty complex interactive networks. But interestingly, a lot of our unique interactions, our unique caterpillars and unique interactions are happening in our diverse plots. And we basically do this, we build these networks for every single sample replicate. So we now have 60 networks that we've been able to build for a single sampling event. And then we can compare network metrics, for example, caterpillar generality. And so this is basically the average number of plant species that caterpillar species is during that sample. And what you can see is in general, the monocultures, the trees that are growing in monocultures have caterpillars that feed on fewer numbers of species. So I think what we can say here is that we have a more realized, specialized feeding breadth in the monoculture plots. So this is, to some degree, kind of supporting the ideas that I had about how these networks would work, but it's turning out to be a lot more complicated than I initially thought, because these more specialized networks don't necessarily perfectly align with what our textbook recordings of what a generalist or specialist would be. It's really what they are feeding on, what their realized feeding breadth is, rather than something in a book saying this is a specialist or can feed on different types of caterpillars. So that's still developing. Stay tuned. And so I think what I'm learning throughout this whole process is that basically these insects are living in the environment that are created by these tree-tree interactions in the experiment. So when we measure traits, we see that the traits of these trees are very different across the diversity treatments. We also find that canopy cover is much higher on average in the diverse plots versus the non-diverse plots. And so how and why is this happening? And so we can do this by actually going and thinking about the architecture of the trees in the plots. So we've been measuring these individual trees this whole time as well. And we want to look at things like basal area and canopy volume to try to figure out if the shape of these trees is changing in any way. So basically what we're finding is that in the diverse plots, we are seeing these diversity effects where you have larger trees, or you have trees that have more basal area and particularly more canopy volume in diverse plots. Another way to kind of look at this is to think about tree shape. So this is taking the height of the tree and the basal area of the tree and mapping them to one another. And what you can basically see here is that for a given height, you get much wider trees in the polyculture plots. So that could be indicating that we're having some canopy packing happening. So I think what's driving this is basically the trees were planted 2.5 meters apart. In monoculture, they shot up, they competed for light, and so they got fast quickly, and we watched this happen while we were taking the measurements, but then they stopped growing basically. And you have little like truffula tree kind of looking trees. The sycamores, for instance, in the polyculture plots grew tall, but then started growing wide. And they're basically taking advantage of all of the space that their neighbors are not using. And so you end up with very different tree architectures, canopy covers, and traits that are happening in these plots. And this matters You can see this is the very start of these trees. They're now 30 meters tall after 10 experiments. And what we're finding is this does matter for the organisms using these trees. So I had an undergrad, Elizabeth Butts, who went in to look at the spider communities in these plots. And she found that we're getting more spiders using trees in diverse plots on average. But when we look at why this is, what is really happening is that the diversity treatment is changing the percent canopy cover of these trees. So the spiders get more cover and have maybe more microclimate variation. And that means that we end up with more spiders on those trees because diversity has changed the tree shapes and the space where those spiders are interacting. Okay, so just to sum up, what we're finding is that these insects really do seem to care about what spatial arrangement you plant your trees in an experiment. I would say that we didn't have any like pest outbreaks to the point that any of them killed any of our trees. So these are not killing organisms. And so perhaps these diverse plantings could provide better roles for these caterpillars. Do we have, there's a class coming in, right?
Class coming in.
Okay,
So
cool.
I think we may have to cut off
Yeah.
questions, just because last time the class came in and kicked us out.
Cool. All right, so basically all I'm gonna say is that I think we can learn a lot from thinking about these human-made landscapes. And I am happy to take questions about that.
Thank you very much. As long as there's no pressure. You can keep moving.
Yeah.
If there's pressure, then we have to.
I asked, they weren't doing any tests or anything.
Oh, they weren't. That's good. That's good. So they won't be quite as pushy.
It's a good thing we already got some questions in.
Yeah.
Thinking about the value of diversity, then I was wondering for the whole neighborhoods,
Mhm.
like there's a lot of comparing between A and D. Is A like as diverse as urban street trees should be? Or is it like, is it a ceiling or is it a floor?
Yeah, that's really actually a challenging question to look at. It depends on scale, for one thing. So you can look at a city and you can say, so people have created some kind of guidelines, like, okay, let's try to have no more than 10% of the same species, 20% of the same genus, 30% of the same family, for example. And Megan Avolio, who's on this paper, recently did this for all the neighborhoods in Baltimore, and virtually none of them pass, even at like white. But if you look at the whole city, maybe it does pass, right? Because you're aggregating kind of across these different neighborhoods. But for pest outbreaks, it's your local scale that really plays an important role in how those insects are going to move around the landscape. So I don't think we know. I think these experiments are really hard to do, and that's why I kind of like having like a tree diversity experiment where we can really manipulate things and understand it a little bit more. What I've been doing with the community groups who I'm talking to for planning their urban tree plantings is, you know, in your planting, if you lost a species, like, would you be comfortable with that? Like, if you are planning on planting 3 species at 30% each, like, and something comes through and kills one of those, like, would you be happy? Like, would you be fine with that? And kind of getting them to sort of think through it in that risk assessment kind of way. But I don't think we have a good, like, empirically determined sort of this needs to be the way it is.
Okay, I think, so I'm gonna stop the recording and then we're gonna have to break down. Just because we get the next class, we're really constrained. I'm really sorry about this.
No, I
Great
understand.
talk. Chris, do you want to, I'm gonna stop the recording, but if you want to ask a last question.
No, I think you've got that higher diversity of bugs with